was reminded of the marshmallow test, and you talk about that a lot at the start of the book because it's famous. Lots of people have heard of it, and it's less famous for having been debunked 3 or 4 or 5 different ways as an indicator as much of class and all sorts of other things as it is a sense of actual willpower. And my brain went to an interesting hypothesis around what the marshmallow test would be like if you did it with other kids in the room. So it's not just you alone in a room trying to resist the temptation, but it's you with a group of other kids in a room trying to resist the temptation, and how the peer pressure piece would work around that.
Well, actually, there was one such example of a marshmallow test study, at least one that I know of, where kids were told basically what other kids did. So kids were put into groups where they wore certain colored T-shirts. And say I'm a kid wearing a red T-shirt. When I go in to have the marshmallow test administered to me, which is, for anyone who doesn't know, who might be listening, this idea that you can take one treat right away, that marshmallow or cookie, or if you wait for an indefinite period of time, you don't know how long, and you're a toddler there waiting, you can get a second treat. So, and it was used basically as a litmus test of whether a kid was capable of delaying gratification. And we know it's a lot more complicated than that. Well, in the experiments done with kids who had certain colored T-shirts and were told what the kids in their peer group did, they tended to, at a higher rate, do what kids who had wore the same
allegedly in the same T-shirt color were doing.
Exactly. Right. And I find it actually promising that that's the case because, of course, there are negative impacts of peer influence we can all point to from kids and teenagers and how they grow up. But I think what's really interesting about this is that, we tend to think of our ability to delay gratification, our ability to think about the future and invest in our own future as some sort of inherent, innate trait that we either have or don't have, and that some kids are just sort of doomed to failure because they don't do well at the marshmallow test. They're not going to get good SAT scores. That was sort of the, I think, popular portrayal of those original marshmallow
Eat a marshmallow, never go to law school. It's as simple as that.
Right. I think some popular conclusions were made around those tests. And I think what's so interesting about the study of the peer groups wearing the same color is that there is this power to influence each other, in fact, for the good, for encouraging waiting, and similar ways of kind of helping encourage positive behavior have been used, for example, to get people to buy into cleaner energy. So an energy company in the Black Forest in Germany used a sort of method of peer pressure, saying, all your neighbors are buying into this cleaner energy, even though it's more expensive, to encourage people to buy that energy. It's done in hotels. You may have experienced this, where they'll say, most of our customers.
I remember hotels. They're distant memory, but I remember them.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's like one of those things where it's hard to relate to our past selves now, right? We're like, actually, we can't relate to our future or our past in these coronavirus times. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is great. Like the in the hotel, having most guests don't have their towels washed more than once every 3 days, but feel free to leave your towel on the floor if you insist on having your towel washed more often. Right. And how that influences people's behavior around that.
Right. And in a sense, it's sort of changing what the default is, right? Like, what's our default expectation? And that's one thing about this pandemic that I think is really interesting, right? It sort of provides the opportunity to hit the reset button on some of our default habits and cultural norms. So I would never have wished this pandemic to be the way that we did this, but the fact that, more companies and more people are thinking about how they commute, or thinking about whether it's necessary to sort of travel by car and plane, and finding creative ways around that is going to change our default and sort of what the cultural norm is. And I think that has promise. I don't think it's the whole solution to our environmental problems, for example, but I think there's something about being able to shift basically what our expectations are of ourselves that will be helpful for whatever policies and politics we need to sort of deal with these larger problems like climate change.
Bina, let me springboard off that and ask you a question that's related in a way, which is dealing with, let's call them negative emotions, dealing with fear and despair and anxiety and uncertainty. and how so often, I think anyway, those emotions can be the underlying current of those vulnerable decision points that we were talking about earlier. When we're feeling despair, we're probably more vulnerable to making poorer, shorter-term decisions. Is there any insight you have around managing that? Do we try and suppress it and force it down? I don't feel the feelings. Is there a way we step into the feelings and process them? Is there any insight you have around how emotional management can help us stay the course?
Yes, and I think you're right to point out that when people feel that doomsday is coming, they tend to turn away from the future. There's some research suggesting that when people are in active military and, kind of deployed in war zones, they'll privilege the present even more. And I think that is certainly true when we sort of see how people behave with respect to sort of dismal predictions of the future.
Right.
So I think it's really, again, this kind of comes down to agency. So is it possible to look at futures, including negative futures, but to do so not only with despair and anxiety, which are normal emotions, which are acceptable emotions, but to also do so with a sense of agency, a sense of how one as an individual or one in a community or society can make an impact on actually changing the course of events, to see the future as not sort of already written, but as something we're writing. And I think it's not the right answer to suppress the despair or the anxiety we feel about the future now. I think it is the right answer to think about ways or places where we can have agency, even if it's a small amount of agency, to do something positive, to shape us, I guess, to shape society towards the positive future that we want.
Hey, it's MBS here. My newsletter is The Works with MBS. Every week I do a short distillation of something essential that will unlock your greatness. You can sign up at mbs.works.